The old ones stood in the doorway of the church, their arms linked together. None spoke a word to another. Wild noise and turbulence rose outside. The light darkened, the wind howled and whined. The snow whirled in and whipped their faces with white chips of ice, and suddenly the rooks were in the snow, hundreds of them, black flurries of malevolence, cawing and croaking, diving down at the porch and shrieking attack and then swooping up away. They could not come close enough to claw and tear. It was as if an invisible wall made them fall back within inches of their targets, but that would only be for as long as the old one's strength could hold. In a wild storm of black and white, the dark attacked, beating at their minds as at their bodies, and above all, driving hard at the sign-seeker, Will. And Will knew that if he had been on his own, his mind, for all its gifts of protection, would have collapsed. It was the strength of the circle of the old ones that held him fast now. But for the second time in his life, even the circle could do no more than hold the power of the dark at bay. Even together, the old ones could not drive it back, and there was no lady now to bring aid of a greater kind. Will realized once more, helplessly, that to be an old one was to be very old before the proper time. For the fear he began to feel now was worse than the blind terror he had known in his attic bed, worse than the fear of the dark that the dark had put into him in the great hall. This time his fear was adult, made of experience and imagination and care for others, and it was the worst of all. In the moment that he knew this, he knew too that he, Will, was the only means by which his own fear could be overcome, and thus the circle fortified and the dark driven away. "Who are you?" he asked himself, and he answered, "You are the sign-seeker. You have 3 of the signs, half the circle of things of power. Use them." The sweat was standing on his own forehead, now as it had done on the rector's, though now the rector and Paul stood in smiling peace, oblivious outside everything that was going on. Will could see the strain on the faces of the others, Farmer Dawson most of all. Slowly he moved his hands inwards, bringing the hands each held closer to one another. John Smith's left hand, nearer to Farmer Dawson's right, and then they were close enough. He joined his neighbor's hands, shutting himself out. For a panicking moment he clutched them again, as if he were tightening a knot. Then he let go and stood alone. Unprotected now by the circle, though sheltered behind it, he swayed under the impact of the raging ill will outside the church. Then, moving very deliberately, he unclasped his belt with the 3 precious burdens and draped it over his arm, took from his pocket the rook's feather and wove it into the center sign, the bronze-corded circle. Then he took the belt in both his hands, holding it up before him, and moved slowly round until he stood alone on the in the church porch, facing the howling, rook-screaming, icy dark beyond. He had never felt so lonely before. He did nothing, he thought nothing. He stood there and let the signs work for themselves. And suddenly there was silence. The flapping birds were gone, no wind howled, the dreadful mad humming that filled the air and the mind had vanished altogether. Every nerve and muscle in Will's body went limp as the tension disappeared. Outside the snow still quietly fell, but the flakes were smaller now. The old ones looked at one another and laughed. "The full circle will do the real job," said old George. "But half a circle can do a lot, eh, young Will?" Will looked down at the signs in his hand and shook his head in wonder. Farmer Dawson said softly, "In all my days, since the Grail disappeared, that's the first time I've seen anything but the mind of one of the great old ones drive back the dark. Things this time. They did it alone. For all our willing, we have things of power again. It has been a long, long time." Will was still looking at the signs, staring, as if they held his eyes for some purpose. "Wait," he said abstractedly. "Don't move. Stay still for a moment." They paused, startled. The smith said, "Is there trouble?" "Look at the signs," Will said. "Something's happened to them. They're glowing." He turned slowly, still holding the belt with the 3 signs as before, until his body was blocking the gray light from the door, and his hands were in the gloom of the church, and the signs grew brighter and brighter, each of them glowing with a strange inward light. The old one stared. Is it the power driving back the dark?" said John Smith's wife in her soft lilt. "Is it something in them that was sleeping and begins to wake now?" Will was trying vainly to sense what the signs were telling him. "I think it's a message. It means something, but I can't get through." The light poured out of the 3 signs, filling their half of the dark little church with brilliance. It was a light like sunlight, warm and strong. Nervously reached out his finger to touch the nearest circle, the sign of iron, but it was neither hot nor cold. Farmer Dawson said suddenly, "Look up there!" His arm was out, pointing up to the nave, toward the altar. In the instant they turned, they saw what he had seen, another light, blazing from the wall. Just as beside them the light blazed from the signs, as it shone out like the beam of a great torch. And Will suddenly understood. He said happily, "So that's why." He walked up toward the second patch of brilliance, carrying the belt and the signs, so that the shadows on the pews and the beams of the roof moved with him as he went. As the 2 lights grew closer and closer together, each seemed to grow brighter still, with Frank Dawson's tall, heavy form looming between them. Will paused in the middle of the shaft of brilliance, reaching out from the wall. It looked as if a slit window were letting light through for some unimaginably bright room beyond. He saw the light was coming from something very small, as long as one of his fingers lying on its side. He said with curiosity to Mr. Dawson, "I must take it quickly, you know, for the light still shines from it. If the light is not shining, it can't be found at all." And putting the belt with the sign of iron and the sign of bronze and the sign of wood into Frank Dawson's hands, he went forward to the left cleft wall and reached to the small source of the enchanted beam. The glowing thing came out of the wall easily, from a break in the stucco, where the chill-turned flints of the wall showed through. It lay on his palm, a circle quartered by a cross. It had not been cut into that shape. Even through the light of it, Will could see the smooth roundness of the sides that told him this was a natural flint, grown in the Chiltern chalk 15 million years ago. "The sign of stone," Farmer Dawson said. His voice was gentle and reverent, his dark eyes unreadable. "We have the 4th sign, Will." Together they walked back to join the others, carrying the bright things of power. The 3 old ones watched in silence. Paul and the rector now sat tranquil in a pew as if sleeping. Will stood with his fellows and took the belt, and threaded the sign of stone to stand there next to the other 3. He had to squint through half-closed eyes to keep the brightness from blinding him. Then, when the 4th sign was in position next to the rest, all the light in them died. They were dark and quiet, as they had been before, and the sign of stone showed itself as a smooth and beautiful thing with the gray-white surface of an undamaged flint. The black rook's feather was still woven into the sign of bronze. Will took it out. He did not need it now. When the light went out of the signs, Paul and the rector stirred. They opened their eyes, startled to find themselves sitting in a pew when a moment ago, it seemed to them, they had been standing. Paul jumped up instinctively, turning his head turning, questioning. "It's gone!" he said. He looked at Will